Hello, this is Mike Nemeth, Communications Director for the California Apartment Association. I'm here to welcome you to CAA's webinar, The City of Los Angeles, COVID-19 Eviction Moratorium and Rent Freeze. With the rash of COVID-19 related eviction moratoria and rent freezes that have been adopted throughout the state, it can be a challenge to keep everything straight. Today's webinar will cover the key ground rules in the City of Los Angeles that rental housing providers need to know during the crisis. Here to discuss those rules, we have Beverly Kenworthy, CAA's Vice President of Government Affairs for the City of Los Angeles, and Whitney Prout, the association's Legal and Compliance Counsel. Before we get started, I have a legal disclaimer to share. CAA strives to provide accurate and timely information to assist its members. This seminar offers general information only and is not intended as legal advice. For legal advice on your specific property, please contact an experienced attorney. Information presented in this seminar is subject to change. Stay tuned and keep informed with CAA. Now I'd like to turn over the webinar to Whitney.
Thanks, Mike. In today's webinar, we're going to give a quick overview of the progression of the COVID-19 related eviction protections and rent freezes that have been adopted in the City of Los Angeles. We'll start by going through the timeline of events, and then we'll jump in to discuss the substantive provisions of the eviction moratorium and the rent freeze. So Beverly, the eviction protections in the City of LA have been a bit of a moving target during this crisis. Can you walk us through a timeline of what's been happening there?
Sure. So the timeline begins back in early March 4th to be exact, when the mayor declared a local emergency. 11 days later, on March 15th, the mayor used his emergency powers to declare an eviction moratorium, prohibiting the eviction of tenants who could not afford to pay their rent because of COVID-19 related reasons.
And really quick before you go on, just a note to everyone watching that we will be talking more about the substance of the eviction moratorium after we go through the timeline. So if you're wondering about the specifics, just hang tight, we're gonna get to that. All right, sorry, Beverly. So that was, I think we got to March 15th, and then what happened next?
No problem. So the next thing that happened was March 23rd, when the mayor issued another executive order using his emergency powers that expanded the eviction moratorium to prohibit no-fault evictions, including Ellis Act evictions.
Yeah, and for anyone that's not familiar, the Ellis Act is a state law that gives rental property owners the ability to exit the rental market, in other words, to go out of business. And in doing so, the right to terminate the tenancies of anyone living at the property that's being shuttered.
Right. At this point, the city council has been watching what their mayor was doing and stepped in and codified the eviction moratorium that had been created by the mayor's various executive orders, and then built on that by limiting landlords' ability to evict even for certain violations of the lease, such as fostering in a shelter pet that needed somewhere to go because animal shelters were shutting down, or giving tenants who had COVID-19 related hardships 6 months to pay back the rent after the COVID-19 crisis is over.
And of course, it didn't stop there, did it?
Oh, no, it doesn't. March 30th, we saw the mayor issue yet another executive order, this time to implement a rent increase freeze on rent stabilized units in the city. Then later that same day, the city council met and amended the eviction moratorium to extend the repayment period for rent deferrals from 6 months to 12 months in response to the county board of supervisors having done the same thing in the county eviction moratorium. Then the next day, the mayor issued a new executive order, this time to rescind his previous orders that related to the eviction moratorium.
And to be clear, when the mayor issued that order rescinding his previous executive orders on the eviction moratorium, that was basically just a cleanup measure since the city council had enacted an ordinance that codified the eviction moratorium. And that way there was no conflict between what the mayor had done and what the council had adopted, right?
Exactly. And that executive order was very clear that it did not rescind the rent freeze because at that point, the council had not yet taken up the issue of a rent freeze.
And so that was as of March 31st, the council hadn't taken up the issue of a rent freeze, but that has since changed, hasn't it?
It has. So just the other day, on April 22nd, the council considered several expansions of tenant protections. The good news is that they voted to reject a further expansion of the eviction moratorium, but they also voted to direct the city attorney to draft an ordinance to extend the rent freeze so that it lasts for 360 days after the end of the local crisis.
Yeah, well, it's been sounds like it's been quite the roller coaster, it sounds like. So let's jump into the specifics of the law as it stands today, and we'll start with the eviction moratorium. The first thing to note is that the eviction moratorium applies to all residential units in the city of Los Angeles, not just those that are covered by the rent stabilization ordinance. Or even just those covered by the statewide rent control and just cause eviction law, commonly known as AB 1482. So these eviction rules we're going to be talking about today, these apply across the board to all residential units in the city. And Beverly, can you talk a little bit about how long this eviction moratorium is going to be in effect?
The moratorium itself, as it's currently written, stays in effect for the duration of the local emergency. But as we'll talk about here in a minute, some of the effects of the moratorium will be around for longer.
Yeah, and before we get into that, a very important timely note, the eviction moratorium ordinance requires landlords to give notice of the moratorium to their tenants. And the City Housing and Community Investment Department has created a form you can use to do that that summarizes the various protections. We have a link to that webpage at the end of the video that you can go to find this form that you see previewed on the screen here. But this notice has to be sent out to your residents by April 30th. So if you haven't done that yet, do that ASAP. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about the portion of the eviction moratorium dealing with non-payment of rent. I think this is probably the item we get the most questions about. Beverly, what does the eviction moratorium say about eviction for non-payment of rent in the city of LA?
It basically says that evicting for non-payment of rent is off the table if the reason the resident is unable to pay rent is because of COVID-19.
And what sort of things are considered COVID-19 related hardships that allow a resident to take advantage of this protection in the moratorium?
Well, the ordinance just says that the inability to pay has to be due to circumstances related to COVID-19 pandemic, but does not give very specific examples of what that might include. And those are listed on the screen here. Loss of income due to workplace closure or reduced hours due to COVID-19, loss of income or increased childcare expenditures due to school closures, healthcare expenditures stemming from COVID-19 infection of the tenant and or of the tenant's household who was ill with COVID-19, and reasonable expenditures stemming from government order emergency measures.
Yeah, and so I mean, those are pretty standard examples of COVID-19 related hardships that entitle the tenant to protection under the eviction moratorium that we've seen in other places. But one thing that is a little bit different in the city of LA is that they provide these protections to tenants that have these hardships, but they don't have an express requirement for the resident to notify their landlord that they have one of these hardships, or to provide documentation of the hardship. So that's something that you do see in some other eviction moratoria, but you don't see that in the city of LA. However, if you want to be proactive, and we do recommend that you get proactive, CAA has created a sample letter you can send to your residents, which essentially lets the resident know that you would like to work with them if they are unable to pay rent because of a COVID-19 related hardship, and requests that they use a notification form that's been provided actually by the California Attorney General's office for residents to use to avail themselves under a separate set of protections under the governor's executive order. But so that's one option. But Beverly, the city's also made a form available too, right?
Yes, they have. The City of LA's Housing and Community Investment Department has also made a form available that residents can choose to use to notify landlords that they are unable to pay the rent because of a COVID-19 hardship.
Yeah, so these are two great options. They have slightly different purposes. One is the letter from CAA that you can send to your residents, and you can include with that either the Attorney General form or the City of LA form that Beverly just mentioned that essentially asks your tenants to notify you if they're having trouble and gives them a means by which to do that. But very, very important to note, these forms are optional for use by the resident. You cannot, under the LA ordinance, require the resident to notify you or provide documentation in order to avail themselves of the protections under the LA ordinance. That said, it's always a good idea to keep that line of communication open with your residents, now more so than ever. You can find that sample letter and the Attorney General form on the CAA COVID-19 resource page, which is caanet.org/coronavirus. We'll have a link to that at the end of the video. And then the city form that Beverly mentioned that you can also see previewed on the screen here, that's available on the City Housing Department's website, and we'll have a link to that at the end of the video as well. But wait, there's more. If a resident is unable to pay rent because of COVID-19, the ordinance also prohibits landlords from charging late fee or interest on that rent. But there's a little bit of good news too, right, Beverly?
Sure. The good news is that the ordinance does make clear that the rent is not waived. The resident remains on the hook for that rent, though they will get an extended period to pay it back. As we mentioned earlier, the City Council voted to give residents 12 months after the local emergency ends to pay the back rent.
Yeah, and landlords and tenants do have the option under the ordinance to agree to one of several payment plans outlined by the Housing Department, and you can find more about those options, again, on the Housing Department's website that we'll link to at the end of the video. So let's move on. As we mentioned earlier, the ordinance doesn't just limit evictions for non-payment of rent. It also limits the ability of landlords to terminate tenancies for no fault reasons. Beverly, what's considered a no fault reason for terminating? That, of course, is now prohibited under the ordinance.
Sure. Well, it's broadly defined as any eviction which is not based on any fault or action of the tenant.
And yeah, so that's very broad. We've put up some common examples of what that might include. So that would be things like no cause 30 or 60-day notices, owner move-in evictions, terminations based on renovations. And actually the ordinance even has a provision specifically saying that terminations based on the Ellis Act, which we mentioned earlier, state law that gives landlords the right to go out of business, pull the property out of the market, restricts those, I think actually until even 60 days after the end of the local emergency. So that one actually even lasts a little bit longer.
So it's also important to keep in mind, unlike non-payment protections, the protection from no-fault evictions applies to everyone, not just those with COVID-19 related hardships.
Yeah, that's a great point. This is an across-the-board protection. It's not just people who have, maybe lost their job or something like that. And then one of the more, I'll call it unique aspects of the LA moratorium is that it also restricts the landlord's ability to terminate the tenancy of a resident who has violated the lease in ways other than not paying rent. And specifically, the City of LA ordinance prohibits landlords from seeking to evict residents who have violated their leases by having unauthorized occupants move in or guests, or who have engaged in nuisance behavior or have unauthorized pets, provided that the violation is related to COVID-19. And, Beverly, this is, like I said, a little unique. Could you talk a little bit about why the council adopted this provision?
Sure. Some of the council members were concerned that residents who were trying to help out family members who had to bring family members in to live with them, some of those family members may have had to come with pets, or they had taken in shelter pets would be penalized if it violated their lease. So they pushed to have this provision added to the ordinance.
Got it. But the key to keep in mind here for everyone listening is that whatever that violation is, whether it's an unauthorized occupant or pet or a nuisance, it has to be related to COVID-19. So it's not carte blanche for residents to violate their leases without consequence. But if it is related to COVID-19, then the ordinance does give them some protection from eviction for those violations. And then last, but certainly not least, let's talk about the rent freeze. What can you tell us about that, Beverly?
Well, the first thing to know is that, unlike the eviction moratorium, the rent freeze applies only to those units already subject to the city's rent stabilization ordinance. Generally speaking, that's properties with 2 or more units built on or before October 1st, 1978.
Yeah, and so the reason for the distinction here, why the rent freeze is more limited to than the eviction moratorium, is because local governments are limited under the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, which is a state law that limits local ability to place rent controls on all rental properties. Is that right, Beverly?
Yep, that's right.
Okay. And then I guess maybe this was presumed, but always good to clarify. As the name suggests, the rent freeze basically halts rent increases for the time being, for as long as it stays in effect, right?
Yes, and as our viewers might remember from the beginning of the webinar, the rent freeze was initially adopted by the mayor via executive order, but the city council thought having a rent freeze was a grand idea and just in the last couple of days took up the issue and decided not only to ratify the rent freeze the mayor ordered, but also directed the city attorney to draft an ordinance extending the rent freeze so that it lasts nearly a full year after the local emergency ends.
And just procedurally, Beverly, where that puts us today is that essentially the mayor's rent freeze order is still in effect, and the city council, the city attorney will come back with an ordinance extending it that the council is expected to, of course, approve since they're the ones that told the city attorney to draft it in the first place, right?
Well, we think there was some confusion during that vote, but we are expecting an ordinance to come back for hopefully further discussion before
Okay,
it's enacted.
got
Okay,
it. So stay tuned, right?
stay tuned.
All right. Well, that pretty much wraps up the substantive portion of this webinar that's going to go over the provisions of the ordinance really quick before we close out. As I promised, here is that link where you can find CAA's COVID-19 resource page. That is caanet.org/coronavirus. There's lots of great information on this page, links to all the various eviction moratoria that have been adopted around the state, FAQs, videos, all sorts of things, all available for free, even if you're not a CAA member, though we do, of course, encourage you to join if you're a rental housing provider. If you need a refresher on any of this, check out our Industry Insight that covers the City of LA eviction moratorium and rent freeze, again, available for free. We are actually in the process of updating that right now, but you can find that on that COVID-19 resource page I just mentioned. And then the city's website where you can find information about the COVID-19 renter protections. You can see the link on the screen there. It's a little bit of a longer one, but the city has some FAQs about the eviction moratorium. They also have that fact sheet notice that we showed a little bit earlier available on this page, as well as the notice form that residents can use to notify their landlord if they're unable to pay their rent due to COVID-19. All of that available on the link you see on your screen. Well, I think that wraps us up. Beverly, thank you so much for joining us and talking to us a little bit about what's happening in LA.
My pleasure.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, Whitney here. So since we first recorded this webinar back in late April, the LA City Council has met again and made some changes to the eviction moratorium and rent freeze. The quick summary of those changes is listed on the screen and we'll go through each of them in a second. But basically, the council updated the eviction moratorium to include a new noticing requirement and also created what's called a private right of action, which allows tenants to enforce their rights under the ordinance in court. The city council also extended the rent increase freeze to stay in effect for 1 year after the end of the state of emergency. You'll remember the city council had talked about extending that rent freeze before, back when we originally recorded this webinar, but they hadn't formally adopted the policy. Now they have. So let's jump into each of these. Up first is the new noticing requirement. So you'll recall that the ordinance previously required landlords to send their tenants notice of the COVID-19 renter protections by April 30. That was 30 days after the ordinance originally went into effect. But on May 6th, the council revised that section of the ordinance to now require a new notice, which is really just a revised version of that fact sheet you sent previously. You can see it on the screen there. It should look familiar. And what you'll need to do is send this new revised notice of the renter protections to all of your tenants by May 27th. That is 15 days after this new revised ordinance took effect today, May 12th. And you'll also now have to send this notice of renter protections every time you send any sort of eviction notice, whether it's a notice to pay rent or quit, a notice to perform covenants, or other notice to terminate the tenancy. And that requirement stays in effect through the whole local emergency period and for 12 months after the local emergency expires. Now, very important, this notice does have to be provided on the form that the city produces. Again, you can see it on the screen. It's available on the city's website. We gave you the address to that previously. It's the same website. And you have to provide it in both English and the language predominantly used by each tenant. So because you may not know what language is predominantly spoken by all your tenants, what CAA is recommending is that you provide the notice in all of the languages that the city provides the notice in. Right now, I think they have about 6 languages up, but that may grow. So if you just provide it in all of the different languages, then you know you're covered. Also, very important, this requirement to send this notice by May 27th, that applies even if you previously sent out the notice by April 30th, as the ordinance previously required. So this is a second round of notices that you need to send to everyone, informing them of the protections under the ordinance. Now, in addition to the noticing requirement, the City Council on May 6th also approved a private right of action to be added to the eviction moratorium. This means that tenants who allege their landlord has violated the ordinance can bring a lawsuit to have their rights enforced by the court. And that can include seeking injunctive relief. In other words, the court telling you that you need to change your practices to comply with the ordinance. And they can also seek money damages for non-compliance. The ordinance actually does provide some pretty stiff penalties that can be assessed by the court, up to $10,000 per violation, plus an extra $5,000 if the tenant who is affected is elderly or disabled. It would be up to the court to decide exactly what amount is appropriate based on the circumstances, but those can be pretty stiff. So again, it is very important that you comply with the terms of this ordinance. Now, fortunately, the City Council did include what's called a right to cure, meaning that before a tenant can bring one of these lawsuits, they have to give the landlord notice of the alleged violation and a 15-day period to correct the issue. So that's very helpful. The private right of action does not apply to violations of the requirement we just talked about to send the renter protection notice out by May 27th to all of your tenants. However, that doesn't mean you shouldn't take that requirement seriously. The city could still bring an enforcement action against you directly as opposed to your tenant bringing it if you didn't comply with that requirement, and it could also be used by your tenant as a defense against eviction in the future. So still make sure you're complying with the requirement, but if there was, just a technical slip up, you sent it a day late, it wouldn't be something that your tenant could sue you for in court as they could for other violations. And last but not least, you'll remember the city council had directed the city attorney back in April to draft an ordinance extending the rent freeze to last for 360 days after the end of the local emergency. The city council has since approved that ordinance, and they actually rounded it up to a full year rather than being 360 days. So that rent freeze will now be in effect for a full 1 year after the end of the local emergency period. As a reminder, the local emergency period doesn't have a fixed end date. It's going to be based on the conditions with this pandemic when that ends. So the rent freeze is in effect for the entirety of the local emergency period, plus an additional year after that. And as a reminder, the rent increase freeze, that applies to units that are subject to the city's rent stabilization ordinance. The city has a number you can text actually to find out if your unit is rent stabilized. If you don't know, it generally applies to older multi-unit buildings in the city, but you really need to assess your personal circumstances of your property to see if it applies. And that rent increase prohibits any rent increases. That rent freeze prohibits any rent increases from taking effect while the freeze is in place, unless it's been approved by the housing department, which is really for special circumstances. So you can find, there were a couple of other minor tweaks that were made to the ordinance that we didn't discuss here. All of the changes that were made are discussed in our industry insight on this topic. We have updated it. That is available on our website right now, free both to CAA members and to non-members, though we of course encourage folks who are rental housing providers who are not members to join the association. We have lots of great benefits. And you can find this on our COVID-19 Resource Center webpage. That is caanet.org/coronavirus. All right, everyone, that's all for the update. Thanks so much.